The congressional hearing room grew completely silent as Dr. Jordan Peterson leaned toward his microphone. His voice, marked by a familiar professorial cadence that had captivated millions online, cut through the stillness. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, you're illustrating exactly what's flawed about how rules are interpreted in today's governance," he said, locking eyes with Representative Jasmine Crockett. "Rule 6 of my book argues we should put our own house in perfect order before we criticize others. Yet here you are questioning my stance while your own committee has overlooked key contradictions within this very legislation." The sharp comment stirred murmurs across the packed room as cameras focused in on Crockett. Her expression remained composed despite the public challenge from the well-known psychologist and author. Accustomed to speaking with authority, Peterson continued expounding on rule adherence and philosophical consistency, and aware that Crockett had quietly reached into her briefcase, but what followed left Peterson unexpectedly silent. The former civil rights lawyer and Yale Law School graduate calmly produced a worn copy of Peterson's own best-selling book, visibly marked with colorful tabs. Cameras zoomed in on the evidence. Those familiar with Crockett's precise and well-prepared approach knew what was coming, not an emotional rebuttal, but a point-by-point dismantling of Peterson's claims, using his own words. In just 3 minutes, she would deliver a rebuttal so thoroughly researched and carefully constructed that what began as Peterson's moment of rhetorical dominance transformed into a textbook example of preparation and precision, one that would later be studied in both law and political science classrooms. Before diving into what unfolded next, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more in-depth political analysis. Breaking down the most important public confrontations of our time, the House Oversight Committee's hearing room projected an air of gravity with its polished mahogany walls, deep blue carpet, and the congressional seal proudly displayed behind the chairman. Every seat in the gallery was occupied by journalists, staffers, and intrigued citizens pressed against the back walls. This was no routine hearing. Dr. Jordan Peterson's appearance as an expert witness had elevated the proceedings into a cultural event that transcended partisan politics. Sitting upright at the witness table, even after 3 hours of questioning, the 61-year-old clinical psychologist, professor and best-selling author remained attentive. With millions of books sold worldwide, packed lecture halls across continents, and a podcast dominating global rankings, Peterson had become one of the decade's most influential public thinkers. Dressed in a finely tailored charcoal suit and blue tie, he projected the meticulous precision that had become his hallmark. "He's not just another academic," a senior committee staffer noted during preparations. "His appeal cuts across political lines. He's gained global influence by challenging what he sees as ideological groupthink, connecting with audiences who feel ignored by mainstream institutions." The hearing centered on proposed regulatory reforms impacting academic freedom and campus speech issues on which Peterson had built his reputation, dating back to his high-profile objections to compelled speech laws at Canadian universities. On the other side of the room sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, a second-term Democrat from Texas. At 43, Yale-trained lawyer had made a name for herself before entering politics, handling major civil rights and constitutional litigation. Her royal blue suit and understated gold accents spoke to her courtroom roots, where substance always outweighed spectacle. Since joining the committee, Crockett had become known for her detail-oriented questioning, often uncovering facts others missed. "She doesn't aim for viral clips," her chief of staff noted. "She treats hearings like legal proceedings, thorough prep, focused questioning, and a clear mission to establish facts over scoring points." The stakes for this session went far beyond partisan sparring. The proposed legislation raised core questions about free expression, government overreach, and institutional responsibility in academic settings. Conservatives pushed for the protection of diverse views on campus, while progressives stressed the need to guard against discrimination masquerading as free speech. For Peterson, the hearing offered a platform to reaffirm values he had long championed: intellectual freedom, resistance to enforced ideological conformity, and caution against unintended effects of well-meaning regulations. For Crockett, the issue lay in how the legislation would be enforced. Her team had spent weeks reviewing similar state-level policies and found that ambiguous language often introduced new issues instead of solving old ones. The clash between these viewpoints had been building all morning. Exchanges remained mostly respectful but intellectually charged, with Peterson skillfully navigating questions through the rhetorical strengths that made him such a compelling speaker, as Chairman Davis stated. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas for 5 minutes. The mood in the room shifted. Neither Peterson nor Crockett could have predicted how their distinct approaches to intellectual rigor would soon collide, and how that encounter would dramatically alter how both their positions were perceived. The morning had unfolded with growing tension as various members questioned Peterson and the panel. Peterson responded to most inquiries with the assured tone. He was known for often steering conversations toward broad philosophical ideas when details felt limiting. When Representative Crockett began her turn, she opened with a composed and deliberate style shaped by her legal training. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she said clearly. "Dr. Peterson, I'd like to discuss Section 4 of the proposed legislation, which addresses how we enforce protections for diverse viewpoints on college campuses." Peterson nodded. He had answered similar questions earlier but appeared ready to expand further. Crockett continued. "This bill proposes a new federal body to investigate complaints of viewpoint discrimination and penalize institutions that violate the rules. I have concerns about the constitutional implications of such a move." She then read directly from the legislation. The Commission shall have broad investigatory authority, including access to internal communications, course materials, and hiring records when there's evidence of viewpoint-based discrimination. Looking up from the document, she asked, "Dr. Peterson, given your long-standing concerns about administrative overreach in academia, are you comfortable supporting a federal body with such sweeping authority to monitor university operations?" The question highlighted a potential inconsistency between Peterson's public stance against bureaucracies and his support for this policy proposal. Legal observers immediately recognized the strategic framing of her inquiry. Peterson adjusted slightly in his seat before answering. "That's an excellent question, Congresswoman," he said. "I've certainly spoken against the dangers of expanding bureaucracies and how they can suppress genuine intellectual dialogue." He paused, clearly weighing his response. "However, I'd make a distinction between bureaucracies that enforce conformity and those intended to promote diverse viewpoints. If appropriately limited, the latter might be a necessary corrective to existing systemic biases." It was a careful and layered answer, acknowledging complexity while still defending the bill. Several Republican members nodded in agreement with his framing. Crockett pressed on, calm and measured, but wouldn't, adding another layer of federal oversight, regardless of intent risk, creating the same kind of bureaucracy you've warned against, especially one with the power to examine internal messages and hiring practices. This follow-up made the contradiction even sharper, but her tone remained inquisitive rather than confrontational. Peterson's expression grew more serious. He appeared to recognize that Crockett's line of questioning wasn't just political. It was methodically constructed and leading somewhere deeper than what he had encountered from others. "I understand your concern," Peterson responded, his tone returning to a more academic cadence. "But it's important to recognize that in some cases, targeted interventions are necessary to rebalance institutions that have been overtaken by specific ideological biases, sensing an opening to steer the discussion toward philosophical ground he was more comfortable on. Peterson pressed forward with renewed conviction. This actually relates closely to my work on hierarchies of competence, a subject I've written about extensively, particularly when... Crockett interrupted, courteously, but firmly. "Dr. Peterson, I appreciate the broader context, but my question specifically concerns the enforcement mechanism in Section 4, and whether it aligns with your long-standing advocacy for limiting bureaucratic overreach." This gentle redirection back to the precise policy details, rather than allowing the conversation to drift into abstract theories, seemed to unsettle Peterson. His usual rhythm had been disrupted. Rather than expanding into conceptual frameworks, where he often excelled, the questioning stayed tightly focused on legal specifics. At this moment, Peterson's demeanor changed, realizing the discussion was no longer following the familiar path where he typically thrived. His tone took on a more forceful edge. Congresswoman, he said, fixing her with a steady gaze. With all due respect, you're demonstrating exactly what's wrong with how rules are interpreted in modern governance. He continued. Rule 6 in my book states that one must set their own house in perfect order before criticizing others. And here you are, challenging my views. While your own committee has failed to address the core contradictions in this legislation. This sudden shift from discussing the policy itself to a personal critique grounded in his own writing caused visible tension in the room. Peterson pressed on with his remarks. The problem with congressional oversight isn't a lack of rules, it's the inconsistent application of principles. My writing on rules is not just metaphorical addresses the psychological foundations required for orderly societies. His voice, now taking on the familiar intensity and rhythm of his public lectures, rang with conviction. What's happening in this hearing, he declared, is a focus on surface-level contradictions while ignoring the deeper unity of the underlying values. Then, he added, before questioning the coherence of my views. Perhaps some reflection is needed on the ideological assumptions shaping your own position. That comment, striking a more personal tone than usual for expert testimony, pushed the boundaries of decorum. Chairman Davis shifted uncomfortably, but did not interrupt. As Peterson continued. What he failed to notice was Crockett's measured movement as she reached into her briefcase. Slowly and deliberately, she retrieved a copy of his best-selling book, dog-eared and filled with color-coded tabs. The C-SPAN camera, guided by the instinct of a veteran operator, zoomed in. Viewers at home could clearly see the worn copy of 12 Rules for Life. Heavily marked and clearly well-studied. As Peterson finished, the room went still. All attention now turned to Congresswoman Crockett, who calmly set the book down in front of her. The tabs were clearly visible. The gravity of the moment came not from heightened emotion, but from her composed precision. She adjusted her microphone with the ease of someone who had controlled many rooms before. Thank you for that perspective, Dr. Peterson, she began, her voice steady and confident. I appreciate your reference to Rule 6. She opened the book to one of the tabbed pages and, hurried but deliberate. I've studied your work closely, and I'd like to explore how some of your own principles might relate to the legislation we're discussing. By framing her comments as an exploration rather than a rebuttal, Crockett elevated the tone to a thoughtful, intellectual engagement. A flicker of surprise crossed Peterson's face, perhaps from seeing his own book in her hands, or realizing how deeply she had engaged with his writing. In Chapter 2, Crockett continued, "You're right, and I quote, opportunity lies where responsibility has been abdicated. You go on to argue that new systems often fail when older, neglected structures haven't been addressed." She paused and looked directly at him. This legislation proposes an entirely new federal commission, rather than strengthening existing civil rights enforcement tools. Doesn't that risk falling into the exact trap you've described replacing? Instead of reforming, this sharp reference flipped Peterson's own conceptual lens onto the bill he had been defending. Before he could respond, Crockett turned to another marked section. Also, in your discussion of Rule 9, you warn against assuming disagreement stems from ignorance or malice. You specifically note the danger of ignoring when others may understand something we don't. She let that quote sit for a beat. Then continued, I'm not raising these points to score political victories. Dr. Peterson, I am genuinely concerned that the bill, as written, contradicts the principles you've championed particularly. Regarding bureaucratic excess and the importance of precision in regulation, she flipped to another tab, on page 243. You write about how vague or overly broad rules allow bureaucracies to grow unchecked, often beyond their original purpose. Section 4 of this bill lays out investigatory powers with very few boundaries. Something. Your writing warns strongly against asterisk with each citation. Crockett's strategy became clearer. She wasn't countering Peterson with a competing ideology. She was using his own philosophy to challenge the policy's alignment with his views. Asterisk Peterson shifted slightly in his chair. His usual rhetorical fluidity seemed to falter. Asterisk Congresswoman. He began slowly, while I appreciate your close reading of my work, I believe some of these principles are being interpreted more rigidly than I intended. Crockett responded calmly, but firmly. I'm quoting your exact words, Dr. Peterson. If they don't apply here, please explain how a federal commission with such broad powers fits with your concerns about bureaucratic overreach. Asterisk the moment felt less like a political clash and more like an exercise in intellectual accountability. Asterisk Peterson paused. He seemed to be recalibrating. Asterisk, you raise a valid concern about the risk of bureaucratic expansion. He finally said, his tone noticeably more restrained. Yes, mechanisms like this would need very firm limits to prevent mission creeps, something I've certainly warned against. Asterisk, it was a small but important concession. The academic who had begun the exchange in lecture mode was now engaging directly with a well-founded critique. Asterisk. Crockett nodded in acknowledgement and turned to one last tab. Asterisk, my final question relates to your emphasis on precision in language, she said. On page 158, you write, sloppy language creates sloppy laws, and that leads to suffering. Section 4.3 of this bill includes the phrase, reasonable suspicion of viewpoint discrimination, without defining what reasonable or viewpoint discrimination actually means. Asterisk, she paused again, letting the point land. Asterisk, wouldn't this kind of vague wording cause the very interpretive confusion your work warns us about? Asterisk, it was a powerful question, specific, relevant, and rooted in Peterson's own intellectual foundation. Asterisk, the room fell silent again. Every eye on Peterson. And then, something notable happened. Rather than deflect or dig in, Peterson did something. That explained why even among critics his work is often respected. Dr. Peterson engaged with the critique seriously. That's actually a very valid concern, he acknowledged. Precision in language is essential, especially in legislation that carries enforcement powers. He agreed that the section in question could benefit from clearer parameters. In that moment, what began as a partisan confrontation became something far more valuable. A principled discussion on how ideas should inform public policy, a respected intellectual conceding a critique grounded in his own philosophical framework transformed the dynamic. Asterisk, by the end of Representative Crockett's allotted time, the exchange had evolved. What began as a tense back and forth had become a substantive dialogue, exactly the kind of exchange that's rare in congressional hearings. Within hours, the conversation between Crockett and Peterson had gone viral across social media and major news platforms. Asterisk. What captivated the public wasn't merely the sight of a politician challenging a high-profile thinker. It was the rigor of the challenge itself. Outside the hearing room, journalists pressed both participants for follow-up comments. Peterson, typically comfortable in the media spotlight, offered a concise response. Congresswoman Crockett raised substantive concerns that deserve serious consideration, particularly regarding language, precision, and the risk of bureaucratic overreach. These are valid issues that go beyond partisanship. Asterisk, his acknowledgement, grounded in respect for rigorous critique, only strengthened the credibility he had cultivated over decades. Asked whether his views had been misrepresented, Peterson demurred. No. She clearly studied my work carefully and applied its principles thoughtfully. That's the kind of engagement I've always championed. Asterisk, Crockett's remarks to the press echoed the same seriousness. Today's discussion raised critical questions about how we draft laws affecting academic institutions, she said. Dr. Peterson's work actually helps us think through the unintended consequences of well-intentioned legislation. My hope is we can incorporate those insights as we revise the bill. Rather than revel in political victory, Crockett focused the spotlight back on the legislation. Her commitment to substance over spectacle mirrored what had made her questioning so impactful in the first place. As clips circulated online, reactions broke from the usual partisan patterns. Commentators across the political spectrum praised the exchange not for who won, but for how it elevated the quality of discourse. On CNN, legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin noted, "What made this unique is that Crockett didn't oppose Peterson ideologically. She used his own framework to examine whether the bill lived up to its stated principles." On his podcast, conservative commentator Ben Shapiro agreed. Crockett's questioning was a masterclass in intellectual engagement. She didn't go after Peterson personally. She tested whether the policy aligned with his philosophy. That's exactly the level of analysis Congress needs more of. Progressive outlets like the New Republic similarly focused on the method. Their piece, titled Beyond Partisanship: What Crockett's Method Teaches About Oversight, argued that grounding critique in a witness's own framework creates space for genuine dialogue rather than political theater. For Peterson, the moment had unexpected upside. His thoughtful response earned respect even from those skeptical of his broader positions. Academic journals praised his intellectual consistency, his willingness to engage deeply even when it challenged his initial stance. And the impact wasn't just rhetorical. Within a week, the committee announced substantial revisions to Section 4 of the bill addressing precisely the concerns Crockett had highlighted using Peterson's own ideas. The changes centered on clarifying language and limiting vague enforcement authority. It was a rare outcome. Legislation improved through open substantive exchange. For Crockett, the aftermath brought real influence. 3 committee chairs from both parties sought her input on crafting bill language. A senior Republican colleague remarked privately, "She knows how to translate principles into precise legal text. That transcends party." Law schools and policy programs began using video of the hearing to teach legislative drafting and oversight strategies. One course at Georgetown Law built an entire seminar around the exchange, exploring how to translate abstract principles into governance frameworks. 6 months later, when the revised legislation passed with bipartisan support, both Crockett and Peterson were publicly credited. The final version included carefully rewritten enforcement language, a direct result of their dialogue. In a rare gesture of cross-partisan acknowledgement, Peterson praised Crockett in his statement. "This bill now strikes a better balance between protecting viewpoint diversity and avoiding administrative overreach, thanks in large part to Representative Crockett's incisive critique." The respect was mutual and it was earned not through performance, but through principled engagement. 3 years later, the ripple effects were still felt. The bill became a model for careful, bipartisan legislative drafting. Education policy experts cited it as an example of how rigorous policy discussion can protect rights without expanding state power unnecessarily. Harvard Law professor Noah Feldman called the exchange one of the few recent cases where legislation was genuinely improved by substantive deliberation rather than compromise for compromise's sake. Peterson later included a reflection on the event in his book, The Responsibility of Intellectual Consistency. In lectures, he referenced it often, being confronted with potential inconsistencies between one's principles and specific applications. "That's where serious thinking happens," he told a sold-out audience at the University of Chicago. The credibility he gained by engaging so sincerely with critique further cemented his reputation as an intellectually serious thinker even among ideological critics. Meanwhile, Crockett used the moment not as a peak, but a platform. Her office became known for deep, non-partisan legislative research. 3 bills she helped draft passed with strong bipartisan support, each characterized by precise language and safeguards against unintended consequences. Asterisk, she didn't just ask smart questions, observed Maria Hernandez of the Congressional Research Service. She showed how lawmakers can improve governance by engaging ideas, not just opposition. Asterisk, the exchange spurred institutional changes to committees began prioritizing preparation that tested internal consistency of witness testimony, not just partisan contrast. The House Rules Committee updated its guidance to encourage substantive frameworks of oversight, explicitly referencing the Crockett-Peterson model. Asterisk soon, law schools and public policy programs made the exchange a cornerstone of their curriculum. At Yale, the School of Management launched an executive education course titled From Principles to Policy, inspired by the exchange. It's not about ideology, said Program Director Emma Sullivan. It's about ensuring philosophical consistency in lawmaking. That's what made this moment powerful. Asterisk, even political media took note. Analysts shifted focus away from theatrical moments toward the substantive rigor and legislative outcomes of hearings. The phrase Crockett method entered the lexicon shorthand for testing witness arguments against their own principles. Asterisk focus groups revealed something surprising. Independent and moderate voters began valuing thoughtful engagement over viral text. A leaked strategy memo from a Democratic pollster observed, post-Crockett, swing voters increasingly respond to evidence of genuine policy mastery. Republican consultants noted the same. Performance without substance is becoming a political liability. Asterisk, the lesson for aspiring leaders. Flash may get you headlines, but substance builds legacy. Asterisk, candidates started asking for policy briefings, not just media training. Universities created seminars focused on translating values into law, and civic institutions, long dismissed as broken, began quietly adjusting to the idea that seriousness still had a role to play. Asterisk, as political scientist Francis Fukuyama noted, the Crockett-Peterson exchange was a rare moment where democratic deliberation prevailed over performance. Not because disagreement disappeared, but because it was taken seriously. Asterisk, 3 years later, that 3-minute exchange had become a blueprint, not just for a better bill, but for a better way to